China has identified the cause of the
mysterious new virus.
Coronavirus.
There are fears a rapidly spreading virus has reached Australia.
This is a rapidly emerging situation.
Where there are cases, the government can quickly implement targeted measures and focus control efforts where they're needed most.
Together in collaboration with the pharmaceutical companies,
we need vaccines to immunize ourselves.
And then the final solution, which is a year to 2 years off, is the vaccine.
The answer to that is to really close things down.
Hello again. Welcome back to The Abstract. I am your host, Peter Kirby, author of the book Chemtrails Exposed, a New Manhattan Project, and staff writer at Activist Post. This week, we will continue looking at players involved in what I call the New Manhattan Project. Some may refer to this as chemtrails, and chemtrails are a part of what I call the New Manhattan Project. So last week, it was the former Director of Central Intelligence, John Deutsch, and this week we will be looking at the connections between defense contractor Raytheon and the New Manhattan Project. There's some good info to go over here today, so let's get started. Last week, we talked about the connections between former Director of Central Intelligence John Deutsch and his connections to the New Manhattan Project. This week, we will look at the connections between Raytheon, the giant defense contractor, and the New Manhattan Project. It should be noted that John Deutsch even served as a director at Raytheon, so we saw all his connections last week, and now we're going to look at Raytheon itself, and it just doesn't stop with these people. It's so much, there's way too much to cover in this video. It would be, if I were to cover everything, the video would be over an hour, but I'm going to boil things down for you today. You know, this is because the evidence indicates that Raytheon is the contractor for most, if not all, of the electromagnetic energy aspects of the New Manhattan Project. And again, if you're not familiar with the term New Manhattan Project, I suggest looking into my Activist Post archives or checking out my book, Chemtrails Exposed, a New Manhattan Project, available on Amazon. You can search it on Amazon, or there's a link on the homepage of my website, peterакirby.com. So let's go back to the beginning. One of the founders of Raytheon was Vannevar Bush. Now, if you've read my book, you know there's lots of connections between Vannevar Bush and today's New Manhattan Project. Vannevar Bush was, in fact, the founder of the military-industrial complex, and I make the argument for that in my book. He was the chairman of the National Defense Research Committee. This was a wartime committee designed to streamline the process of bringing advances in technology to the front lines of World War II. And during the creation of along the way, Vannevar Bush was also instrumental in producing the first black budgets as part of his activities at the National Defense Research Committee. And the classic example of this was the original Manhattan Project itself. It was a black project with a black budget, and these things were new to America at the time. He basically revolutionized the relationship between the taxpayer or the government, the scientific community, and the military. And so, Vannevar Bush was the top executive of the original Manhattan Project. He was also a co-founder of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory, which I go on about quite a bit in the book. There were a couple of key technologies very applicable to today's new Manhattan Project were first developed during the wartime Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory. And of course MIT is also, extremely connected to this whole thing. I could go on and on about MIT. Maybe that'll be another one, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the new Manhattan Project. But there's just so much of it in the book. It's kind of redundant, really. But Bush was also served as vice president of MIT. He was chairman of the MIT Corporation after the war. He advocated for weather control, which I believe is the central purpose. The evidence indicates that weather control is the central purpose of today's new Manhattan Project. There's lots of other things going on, but I do believe that weather control has been the driving force. The desire to control the weather has been the driving force over the years, propelling this project forward, and to this day is the central purpose of the new Manhattan Project. And there's even more about Bush in my book. Like I said, today we're not going into depth into things. It gets, complicated, saying, oh, this company and this person, it becomes like a slew of all these different things. But we're going to try to keep it about Raytheon. And my next heading here is Raytheon's relationship with Howard Hughes's former company. We'll just call it Hughes. It had a lot of iterations. There was Hughes Aircraft, Hughes Tool Works, Hughes Aerospace. But if you catch me just saying Hughes, then I'm kind of generalizing. But in early 1997, shortly after the large-scale domestic spraying began, Raytheon acquired Hughes. And it goes on and on about Hughes. Hughes has tons and tons of connections to the new Manhattan Project. If you want a lot of detail about Hughes, I wrote an article called Tex Thornton and the new Manhattan Project, and that goes into Litton Industries and the Whiz Kids, if you know who they were, the post-war technologists and all that. Hughes had a lot to do with Tex Thornton there. And most notably for the new Manhattan Project, though, Hughes, which was acquired by Raytheon, was into satellites. They dominated in the satellite area, and they also dominated in defense electronics. And I guarantee you there is mountain loads of electronics going into the new Manhattan Project. And the former head of Hughes Aircraft was a guy by the name of Albert Bud Whelan. People called him Bud. And he was the first director of the Central Intelligence Agency's Directorate for Science and Technology. And the CIA, the evidence indicates that the CIA is the overall manager of today's new Manhattan Project. And I make quite a case for that in my book. But there he is, former head of Hughes Aircraft. He was also the first director of the CIA's Directorate for Science and Technology. And Hughes, there are a couple of famous patents associated with the new Manhattan Project. One is called Stratospheric Wells Box Seating for the Reduction of Global Warming. And then there's another one called Selective Thermal Radiators. And both of these patents kind of talk about the same thing. We're talking about the Welsbach effect, which is very pertinent to the new Manhattan Project. And both of these patents, key patents pertaining to the atmospheric Welsbach effect, were assigned to Hughes Aircraft. So when Raytheon acquired Hughes, they became the owners of these patents. This is where they're talking about spreading particles in the atmosphere, and not the stratospheric Welsbach seating for reduction of global warming. They don't talk about electromagnetic energy in there, but they're talking about electromagnetic energy in selective thermal radiators, using electromagnetic energy to manipulate airborne particles, which I believe is the basis of the new Manhattan Project. Those are some key patents that belong to Raytheon now since their acquisition of Hughes. And in fact, there are 12 what we call HARP patents that they describe what the high-frequency active auroral research project up there in Alaska, what the antenna array up there can do. And Raytheon owns all 12 of those patents. They were included in their 1995 acquisition of E-Systems. 1995 was right before the spraying started. And these patents, they explain all these things that HARP can do. Some of it is weather control. Other things are, causing earthquakes and seeing into the earth, and it goes on and on. These patents were assigned to APTI, and then E-Systems bought them, and then Raytheon bought E-Systems. But E-Systems has basically been a subsidiary of the Central Intelligence Agency. It's kind of like a shell company, basically, for the CIA. Raytheon has been the historical leader in something called power beaming, and this is applicable to the New Manhattan Project. My science advisor advises me that this is not happening, but I think that there's a overwhelming amount of evidence indicating that the planes of today's New Manhattan Project are remotely powered, that they don't operate on jet fuel, that they operate on energy, electric energy that is beamed to them from the ground, and possibly from satellites, and possibly from bouncing the power off of the ionosphere. The HARP antenna is very powerful. It operates on amazing amounts of natural gas from the North Slope of Alaska, and it can generate extremely powerful beams. And I think it would be extremely advantageous to the New Manhattan Project to be able to remotely power the planes. That way you have more room for the chemtrail spray. You can just put it in the wings where the fuel would normally be. And you can look back through this whole history of Raytheon's participation in this area. I detail quite a bit of this in my book. There's so many patents pertaining to the remote powering of aircraft in particular that it's just too much for me to pass over. And so I am suggesting that Raytheon has been providing the technology for the remote powering of aircraft participating in the New Manhattan Project. Also, more famously known in our anti-geoengineering community, Raytheon since 2005 has been running the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration's system known as Advanced Weather Interactive Processing System, or AWIPS. And AWIPS aggregates all American meteorological data in order to produce weather forecasts. They're like the point by which all weather data is funneled and then distributed to the America and the rest of the world. So Raytheon is in control of that. They monitor that. They're the gatekeeper there of all weather information. That's convenient for them, if they are what the evidence suggests they are. And today's Raytheon is involved in many other scientific areas pertaining to weather. They say that they are all concerned about global warming, which is another theme of the New Manhattan Project. The establishment's excuse for the lines, or the potential lines in the sky, is that, well, we might need to spray you because of that global warming is going to get so bad. When, as I've said many times, the total amount of atmospheric carbon, they're talking about atmospheric carbon all the time, like, oh, that atmospheric carbon causes that global warming, right? Yeah, well, only 3% of atmospheric carbon is caused by man. This is not disputed. 97% of atmospheric carbon is naturally occurring. So I have yet to have an explanation as to why this 3%, which is the same as the other 97%, how this 3% is such a problem and is going to have such a tremendous impact upon the global temperature of the Earth. But Raytheon, like many other giant corporations, they're espousing the theory of man-made global warming. They all do so in unison, just as their forefathers in the Rockefeller family and the Rothschilds and the UN and all the rest of these people have been talking about it. They started it all. Came from the top down, not the bottom up. Think about it, people. But Raytheon, of course, they espouse the theory of man-made global warming, giving the excuse for spraying chemtrails already before they've even been caught. Well, I did kind of catch them here, but I can't say that. I can't say guilty because they might sue. I'm just showing you the evidence. And here's Raytheon with their promo photo, and it shows a plane spraying a chemtrail. This is kind of the cherry on top of today's little expose here. And it says, "The future of aerospace and defense, saturating the atmosphere with particles of coal fly ash." Yes, it is. You can do a lot with hitting those atmospheric particles of coal fly ash, I tell you. And that's not all. I found this Raytheon promotional video which depicts a chemtrail being sprayed in front of the moon, as you can see here. Anyway, so I hope you enjoyed the little overview of Raytheon and the new Manhattan Project today. Like I said, many details were left out. I could go on and I could write a lengthy paper about Raytheon and the new Manhattan Project. I just didn't feel like boring you today. There's so many more complex connections to Operation Paperclip Nazis, the Council on Foreign Relations, Vice Admiral Raborn, Ronald Fogelman, the original Manhattan Project, the Davis-Monthan Boneyard, autonomous aircraft, the Atomic Energy Commission, and more. If you haven't read my book, a lot of those names aren't going to ring a bell with you, but if you have, you understand like the depth of Raytheon's involvement here. It's compelling me to want to go back and just read every single annual report they've ever put out, because they just seem so key to the whole project here. And like I said, you want to dive in deeper and get the big picture, go get my book, Chemtrails Exposed, A New Manhattan Project, and more evidence is bound to come out on Raytheon, so stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of The Abstract. I plan to be back again next week with a new episode, and I intend to call it Hippies, Brought to You by the CIA. And I do believe that they were. So stay tuned. See you next week.